Нет войне! Нет войне!
Нет войне. It means no to war. To utter those words in Russia today is an act of courage and defiance against an Orwellian regime that has outlawed the very use of the word war. Protests continued over the weekend in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and more than 50 other cities across the country. Nikita went to yesterday's demonstration near the Kremlin. He'd hardly been there 5 minutes, he told me, before police arrested him.
I arrived and somehow managed to get through the cordon that had been put up around the square, and I realised there were far more police officers than protesters. And as soon as people arrived, the police detained them and put them in the police vans.
It's difficult to say exactly how widespread these protests are. Most independent media has been shut down, and the police are skillful at making sure large crowds don't get a chance to congregate. But an independent monitoring organisation says there have been more than 13,000 arrests in the past 12 days, with a record 3,000 yesterday in Moscow alone. And the authorities seem to be trying to do everything to discourage further protests.
What we see now is increased violence by the police. For example, yesterday, some women were tortured in police stations in Moscow. I mean, really tortured. And the policeman, there is audio files of that, so there are just like real proof of that.
We've listened to two of these recordings. On one, you can hear what sounds like someone being beaten. On another, a police officer can be heard threatening violence. We haven't been able to independently verify these recordings, but they have been published by Novaya Gazeta, one of the few remaining independent media organizations whose editor won the Nobel Peace Prize last year. Last time people came out onto the streets in Russia in large numbers was 10 years ago, when Vladimir Putin returned to the presidency after a short stint as prime minister. Those protests were mercilessly quashed. Things are even tougher now. It's very unlikely that street protests are going to persuade Vladimir Putin to change course, let alone somehow remove him from the Kremlin, at least at the moment. So how might change come about in Russia? Well, it's often said that change happens from above, whether it be change of policy or some kind of palace coup. In other words, from those close to him in the Kremlin. It's sometimes helpful to think of Putin not as an individual, but as an institution, the instrument through which power is exercised in Russia and through which wealth is accumulated. Putin's power rests on a three-legged stool. One leg is the so-called siloviki, literally the strongmen, the people in the security apparatus, the FSB, the military, people like Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu and Valery Gerasimov, the head of the armed forces. The second leg is the technocrats, the career politicians who make the system work, people like Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov or the Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. Leg number three is the oligarchs, the money men. Some of them are familiar faces like Roman Abramovich or Oleg Deripaska. Mr. Deripaska today tweeted, "We need peace as soon as possible, as we have already passed the point of no return." He joined a growing group of Kremlin-connected businessmen who've had sanctions imposed on them and have expressed opposition to the war, albeit mildly. But what of the other two legs of the stool? One independent Russian journalist, currently outside of Russia, spoke to a high-level insider, a technocrat. He described the situation in, well, unbroadcastable language.
This word in Russia sounds like...
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, yeah. You translated it as clusterfuck.
Yeah.
But it's ruder than that. Putin has become increasingly inaccessible. Apart from perhaps a handful of his closest allies in the Siloviki, most in his so-called inner circle seemed to have no idea what he was planning before he launched his full-scale invasion.
They were as shocked as other people, and that's the weirdest thing. They don't feel responsible. They are just, they feel themselves like regular people who can regular people in Russia who cannot affect the situation. This is the moment when we are in a real black box. I mean, when we're talking about Russia.
Behind the walls of the Kremlin, Vladimir Putin has kept everyone guessing. He's a leader increasingly isolated, not just from the rest of the world, but from those around him too.
Our international editor, Gabriel Gatehouse, reporting there. Well, joining me now is Sir Tony Brenton, former British ambassador to Russia, and Vladimir Putin's former economic policy advisor, Andrei Illarionov. Good evening to both of you. If I can begin with you, Andrei Illarionov. You worked very closely with Vladimir Putin. You were his personal representative of the G8, but you signed an anti-Putin manifesto in 2010. In 2010, could you have envisaged Vladimir Putin engaging in such action with the slaughter of civilians and who are fellow Slavs?
Since year 2012, good evening. Since year 2012, I keep saying that the goal of Mr. Putin is capture of Ukraine, establishing full control of Ukraine. And it is not some kind of fantasy or invention. You can find that text in the article Mr. Putin has written and published in year 2012, in January, in the independent newspaper Независимая газета in Russia, where he proclaimed his goal. Since then, over the last 10 years, he had many opportunities to confirm that his goal to establish full control over Ukraine. And as we learned over the last 3 months, he expanded his appetites. Now he is going to establish control, sphere of influence over half of Europe. Please read carefully what he has produced in the so-called ultimatum to the United States and NATO in December last year, in January and February this year. He said that he needs 1997 division line in Europe with so-called demilitarization and denatoization of Poland, Baltic countries, Bulgaria, Romania. So establishing, returning to the situation that NATO had before 1997. So the plans and goals of Mr. Putin are very clear. But he never hid it.
But as Gabriel Gatehouse said, you know, it might be someone in the Kremlin who could do something about this. How likely is it that somebody could pull him back, or are the whole inner circle signed up?
So the only way that can stop Mr. Putin already not sanctions, not statements, not some kind of accusation of him. This is a hardware policy. This is a war. This is a war, once again, not only against Ukraine. This is European war. Yeah. Hardware attack can be stopped by hardware response. It means that military response. Everybody should understand it very clearly. This aggression can be stopped only by defense, by real defense on the part of Europe, of NATO, of the United States. It's common response. Otherwise, this war cannot be stopped.
Thank you very much for that. Tony Brenton, first of all, a reaction to that, Vladimir Putin has no intention of stopping at Ukraine. He wants the Soviet Union back again.
So first, I should say Andrei is an old friend, and it's good to find myself on the same program as him. No, I think that's an exaggeration. Vladimir Putin is certainly after Ukraine. He's obviously become obsessed with that subject over the period of his isolation during COVID and all of that. And he's going to be very difficult to reverse from the course that he's now taken. I don't think he has any very concrete plans to go beyond that, not least because the sort of countries that naturally fall within his gaze at that point, so places like the Baltic countries, are members of NATO. And if he went for them, he would find himself in a war with NATO. NATO spends about 10 times as much as Russia on...
But Tony Brenton, let me just bring you onto the point which your friend is making here, that actually this was very obvious from 2012. And I wonder if you think that the way that NATO conducted the expansion was...
That is certainly right. I think NATO, we the West, to some extent have brought this on ourselves. We never took seriously Russia's security concerns. And this goes back beyond Putin. This goes back to Yeltsin and to Gorbachev, each of whom said expansion of NATO is going to ruin the liberalization of Russia, is simply going to alienate the Siloviki in Russia, which is exactly what's happened. But that's not really the point now. The point now is that Putin has launched an aggressive war. And the only way of stopping him, and Andrei is right about this, there's nobody around him who's going to stop him. There are demonstrations in Russia, but they're not going to stop him either. They're relatively minor demonstrations by comparison with those 10 years ago. The only thing that's going to stop him is military defeat.
So, what will his response be, do you think, to the Blinken proposal to give MiG jets from Poland to Ukraine and then backfill with American jets? Will that just intensify an air war?
Yes, you will see that as escalation. And he's talked about the ultimate end of escalation, which is the use of nuclear weapons. That doesn't solve the problem. I think the point about what's going on now is that actually his war has the smell of failure over it. We, the West, should be doing everything we can to turn it into a failure and to add to the pressure on him to back off. And there's an encouraging sign today that may be beginning to happen. The conditions for peace set out by Peskov today in his phone conversation with Reuters are significantly less than the conditions for peace set out by Putin when all of this started. So I think things are beginning to edge, roughly speaking, in the right direction.
So, Andrei Illarionov, can you see, albeit it may be in Putin's brain temporary, can you see that actually Vladimir Putin needs to get something out of that? I'm afraid that is the realpolitik. And what do you think, if he thought he was struggling militarily, would he settle for something? Would he settle for something in the east of Ukraine or not?
What I would agree with my friend Anthony is that what can stop Mr. Putin is military defeat. And that is why the West now should do everything possible to guarantee that Mr. Putin would get a military defeat in Ukraine. For that purpose, the West can provide Lend-Lease arrangement for Ukraine right now, to establish no-fly zone right now, to provide actually military deployment of JEF, Joint Expeditionary Forces from NATO, and Britain is a part of JEF, Joint Expeditionary Forces, into Western Ukraine to secure military convoys in Western Ukraine and to secure humanitarian convoys.
Can I just stop you there? Can I just stop there? Because what you said was incredibly interesting there. You actually think that we should establish a no-fly zone. Don't you have the fear that other people have that actually an enraged Putin might unleash a nuclear attack?
No, it's a mistake. Just we have 3 cases when the NATO as organization or United States or even a single country of NATO did something similar, and the response of Putin was no. In year 2008, during Russian attack on Georgia, George W. Bush sent Navy into the Black Sea, U.S. Navy, and sent a U.S. Air Force into Romania and Turkey. 12 hours after that, attack on Georgia was stopped. In year 2015, Turkey shot down a Russian bomber over in the Turkish sky. Just for violation of Turkish territorial integrity. As a result, Putin did nothing. And after that, none of Russian bombers violated Turkish airspace. So,
Tony Brenton, do you agree with that? That might stop him?
In 2018, the United States...
I'm afraid I don't agree with that. The responsibility of the British government, to pick a particularly local example, is to look after the British people, worried as we are about the conditions in Ukraine. And creating the danger of a nuclear confrontation with Russia is obviously a very dangerous route to take. Putin can be defeated without imposing a no-fly zone. Most of the action isn't taking place in the air anyway in Ukraine. And even if Putin wins this round of the war, he has then landed with the unachievable job of controlling a vast country, the second largest country in Europe, 43 million people deeply opposed to him. He will lose either in the war or in trying to maintain control afterwards.
Thank you both very, very much. It would be great to have you straight back on again. Thank you very much indeed.